This is the story of Klaus Alois Lenitschek, a unique man, loved by all, a man who knew no boundaries and never stopped following his dreams.
Many of Dad's traits have been handed down to his offspring, and you too might recognize certain behaviors in his children and grandchildren.
He was on this planet for 89 years, and I've got about 10 minutes to tell you all about him. So come on, let's go. Here we go. We can already hear him. He was born in Sudetenland, a sweet little town of cobbled streets and soft-coloured houses. The square was the heart of it all, lively with market stalls, friendly faces, and the sound of church bells in the air. Horses clip-clop past arcades, children played by the fountain, and life moved gently, wrapped in old-world charm. So let's just pause here for a moment. Here he is, sweet little boy, being held by his grandfather, Alois. It appears that he's looking into the future, wondering what's in store for him. Little did he know, at this point in time, that some 30 years later, he would become my father on the other side of the planet. This is how I recall Dad's life. And it's quite interesting that when sharing these moments with my family, everybody remembers them slightly different. Yep, I inherited Dad's big loud voice, and let me tell you, sometimes a big loud voice can get you in a lot of trouble. You see, whenever Dad had something to say, when he got passionate and excited, his voice used to get really loud, and quite often he was misinterpreted for yelling and screaming. But he also did get his anger out as soon as he felt it. And these days, people actually run retreats where you just go and yell and scream. Because guess what? It does make you feel good. You unload all that anger and you can move on with what's next in your life. In primary school, we used to have competitions who had the scariest dad or the most strict dad. And we used to win hands down every time. Because whenever Dad got excited, the whole neighbourhood could hear it loud and clear. Dad was born into quite a wealthy family, and together with his little sister, Ulrike, they led a really privileged childhood. Their mother, Olga, worked as a secretary in a law firm, and their father, Alois, was a merchant banker. They used to run the local picture theatre, and they were really heavily involved in the local theatre group.
Look at his cheeky little grin, and his eyes are full of curiosity. A boy who's always seeking adventure. I've been told he was quite hard to discipline, but that's where his very strict mum came in, and she could keep him under control. As his mum worked, though, he was often in the care of his nanny, and that's when he got up to all sorts of adventures. Even though he spent his first years growing up during World War II, they had it pretty good. But of course, things can change very suddenly. Dad actually told me a story of one day when he was out in the woods playing with his mates, and they accidentally stumbled across some enemy soldiers who were closing in on the village. They ran back to the village to alert them, but sadly one of his mates didn't make it. He was fatally wounded by the enemy. And from then, things happened rather rapidly. Traumatic events like this stay with you throughout your life. You may think you've got over them, but they're always buried deep within you. And my dad would experience a lot more trauma in the coming years. After the war had ended in 1945, approximately 1.2 million ethnic Germans were expelled from their homes. in Sudetenland. They were violently forced to leave, with up to 15,000 dying, and many of them were Dad's friends and family. Their fate, we still don't know to this day. Lucky for Dad, his mum and dad had foresight, and they decided to act before the Russians caught up with them. His mother took himself and his sister, and they fled with Uncle Hugo in his car towards the German border. His dad stayed back to defend the village. This proved later on to be a big mistake. See, he got caught by the Russians and taken to a prisoner of war camp way out in the back of Siberia somewhere. Here he was repeatedly tortured, and he would eventually die of starvation at an early age of 40. Meanwhile, my grandmother was desperately trying to get her children to safety away from the brutal Russian soldiers. She was trying to get onto a train which would take her into the middle of Germany and into safety. However, you needed certain papers to get on, and she didn't have them. So luckily, she had managed to grab the inherited gold watch and chain before they fled. With the gold chain, she managed to bribe one of the train conductors, and he let her and the two kids on the train bound for safety. And that's how they ended up in Übersee am Chiemsee, in the beautiful part of Bavaria. The train used to stop. When the doors opened, a bunch of people had to get off. They were met there by the local authorities and were taken to a farmer's house. Dad ended up at the Fetzenhof. At first, the Bavarians were very dubious and didn't want them in their homes. They soon realized they were good people, simply seeking safety and a little kindness in a world that had been so cruel to them and had taken all they had. I once asked Dad if he was ever really scared during those war years, but he said, nah, not really. I was a young boy, and to me it was like living in a real-life adventure movie. He didn't really think about the implications until much later in life. Like many kids during the war years, they didn't go to school for quite some time, simply because there was no opportunity to. But when they got to Übersee, both Dad and his sister went to the local high school, where they wanted to integrate really fast. My dad liked school. He was intelligent, but he was also the class clown. He just loved it when people laughed at him, and he could barely sit still. So when Bodo and I and Kay went to the same primary school many years ago, his same teacher could not believe how well behaved and disciplined we were, because he kept thinking of how disruptive my dad used to be. At the age of 14, it became quite clear that my dad wouldn't be able to go to uni because they didn't have enough money to support him. And secondly, he was really not a scholar. So in the village in Übersee, there were two apprenticeships going, one as a baker and one as a gardener. My dad opted to be a gardener. That same year, my grandmother moved to Munich and Dad moved in with his boss. Dad loved his new home and embraced everything it had to offer. He soon became part of the community and had lots of new friends. He enjoyed all the outdoor activities like mountaineering, skiing, kayaking, going to dances, and all the socializing that Bavaria is so famous for. But it didn't take long, and a new adventure was calling. He was in his early 20s when he read about an opportunity to go to Australia on a 2-year working holiday program. He signed up, packed his bags, told his mum in the last minute, who was quite upset about it all, and went up to Hamburg to board a ship for a 6-week voyage to the land down under. He was joined by many other Europeans who are all excited about what this new land would bring. They were meant to learn English on this sailing. Don't know how much they really learned. I do know that he became friends with quite a few Scottish blokes. So when he arrived into Australia, he spoke English with a very strong German Scottish accent. And it did take him a while to get the local Aussies to understand him. On the ship, Dad met Peter Stoffers, a guy from the village next door to his, and they became quite good friends. On arrival, they bought their dream car together, this magnificent sports car. Little did they realise that Australia was predominantly dirt roads, and they were not the same quality as the autobahns they were used to in Germany. Hence, it broke down all the time and was depleting Dad's wallet. He wanted to sell, but his mate wanted to keep it, as it had proven to be quite a chick magnet. So Peter ended up buying Dad out, and Dad bought himself the trusty old V-Dub Beetle. Now the real mystery is, who ended up with the better chick in the end? One of Dad's first jobs when he arrived in Australia was working on a station in country Victoria. He really enjoyed it, but the money was really quite poor. He then read about a job as a lumberjack in Mount Gambier, and he heard the money was quite good. So he followed the money and moved to Mount Gambier. This is when things really started heating up, and his life was about to change forever.
I was 24 years old when I came to Australia in 1963. My sister Rosa and her husband Stefan took me to a dance held by the German club in Mount Gambier, South Australia. As we sat there, I looked around when I saw a man at the entrance looking towards our table. He looked quite different to all the other men there. He had a beard, he wore a white shirt, grey pants, and a darkish red Bavarian jacket. Not really the conventional dress code. And I felt fate was walking towards me. Klaus just looked at me, and when the music started to play, a waltz, he took my hand. And so we waltzed into a life full of happiness, hard work, and amazing adventures.
When Mum informed Dad that they would soon be 3, Dad just stared at her with a blank look. He went to work in silence, but when he came home that afternoon, he took Mum in his arms and said, "Well, I best start building a crib." You know what they say, once you hit your mid-20s, time just zooms by. And well, that's exactly how it felt. Mum and Dad were married for a whopping 60 years. 60! A lifetime full of adventures, a fair share of highs and lows, and a rock-solid partnership that stood the test of time. When their trio of little ones arrived, they knuckled down, worked hard, and managed to buy their very first farm in the lush Otways. It all started when Dad spotted a farm ad, grabbed his sleeping bag and said to Mum, "I'm off to buy a farm." And off he went, just like that. A whole week passed, no calls, no messages, radio silence. Then one day, he strolled back through the door with a grin and a cheeky, "Hello, Mrs. Farmer." But farm life can be tough, and after a brutal drought, they had to move on. They settled in Leopold, just outside Geelong, where Dad landed a job at Alcoa. Now, here's a classic Dad story. One day he came home looking a little worse for wear. Turns out his workmates had roughed him up a bit, all because he was working too hard and making them look bad. Still, he and Mum powered on, working tirelessly to keep up the payments on the farm, and even managed to buy a brand new spec home. Just another chapter in their remarkable journey. Then came 1975, and life threw a curveball when my grandmother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Dad knew it was time to go back and visit, but sadly, he didn't make it in time. But that moment changed everything. It sparked a whole new chapter for our family. Mum and Dad made a bold decision. It was time to take the whole Lenitschek clan to Germany to meet the relatives. The shiny spec home was sold, the farm was packed up, and off we went to Bavaria for what would become a 5-year stint filled with culture, exploration, and more stories than you could ever imagine. Those years were truly magical. Castles, snow-covered winters, hearty German meals, and long summer days spent discovering Europe. But despite the charm of cobblestones and pretzels, the farm in Victoria still called them back. Australia was home, and the pull was too strong to ignore. So we came back, and this time Dad had a dream in mind. He'd always wanted a dairy farm. And during our family trip around Australia, fate stepped in. We rolled into Millamilla, on one of those picture-perfect sunny days. The kind where the sky is impossibly blue and everything just feels right. We explored several properties that day, but it was the farm on Allan J Road that stole all our hearts. And if there's one thing about Dad, it's that he doesn't do things by halves. When he sets his sights on something, consider it done. Before we knew it, we were all packed up again and settling into a life on the Atherton Tablelands. Dad poured his heart and soul into that farm. He built his dream home, yes, with his own 2 hands, and ran a thriving, reliable farming operation. He wasn't just milking cows, he was crafting a legacy. And with Mum by his side, they were truly living the dream, planning globe-trotting adventures, planting roots in paradise, and embracing the life they'd built together. Dad would end up spending 44 years down Allan J Road on his beloved farm, but not without many, many overseas trips and adventures in between.
The favourite memory of our dad is him taking us on mountain hikes and ski tours through the Bavarian Alps where he grew up, and paddling down some crazy rivers in our Canadian canoe. They're all things that he introduced me to that I still love doing with my son Adler now. Another memory was touring around Australia in 1980 for 6 months in the old Range Rover and caravan, trying to find a place to live, and that's where we came through Millamilla and ended up on the farm. Another memory which I'll never forget about Dad is his work ethics. He never gave up. He always enjoyed working hard, and it's something he instilled in in all 3 of us children.
When I was little, most Wednesday afternoons were spent with Dad on supply runs, usually to Plien or Traunstein for our little shop in Grassau. Quite often, and not even around Christmas time, some kid would shout out, "Schau, da ist der Nikolaus." Look, it's Santa Claus. I'd look around excitedly, trying to find him. But nope, they meant Dad. With his white bushy beard and snowy hair, way before his time, I guess he looked a bit like Santa, and he loved it. He'd just grin and play along with it. But for me, he was our Vati, and that meant we had Santa Claus around every day. Pretty lucky, really, hey?
I remember Orpa would always make everyone laugh, and he was always just really brave with whatever he did. Like, he'd just drive his tractor straight down the hill, no worries. My favourite memory is on Magnetic Island when we had a race on the beach, and I remember I just couldn't stop laughing.
I remember Orpa was always really funny, and I could always ask him questions and he'd always know the answer because he was really smart. And he used to always play with us when we were younger and kick a ball with us or do something. I was probably the naughtiest out of all the grandkids, so sometimes I got Orpa really angry and then he'd leave his hand imprint on my bum. And yeah, I really miss you, Orpa.
I always loved the staring competitions Orpa and I would have with us at the dinner table, and having breakfast even. I remember when he'd go swimming in the pond next to the farmhouse. I think it was crazy, swimming with all those crabs. I did like it when we could feed the goldfish. There were hundreds and hundreds that come up. I'm thankful Orpa instilled the love of adventure within my dad, which has passed down to me. Thanks, Orpa.
I remember the first time I went out for dinner out with Klaus and Mimi, and I was a bit scared, but anyway, we got on well. And Klaus was everything I was told. He was big, he had the big white beard, he was loud, and he talked all the time. He was larger than life, and we had a lot of good conversations. It's very hard to get a word in, and it all went really well, I think.
As you've probably gathered by now, Dad had plenty of adventures, more than we could ever fit into one sitting. So before we wrap up things, I'll just have to share one last thing. What I really learned from Dad was this: if you want something badly enough, do whatever it takes, and don't let anyone tell you it can't be done. And that brings me to this car story. So when we were leaving Germany after our 5-year stint, Dad decided we had to do the full relatives tour, visit every last one. Only problem was, he'd already shipped the trusty Range Rover to Australia, and our backup car had blown up. No problem for Dad, he picked up this absolute bargain, and I use the term loosely, for next to nothing. It just needed to survive the rally round. Well, we were almost done when Dad noticed a wobble in the back end. Turns out the rear driver's side tyre was rubbing against something and had started forming a big bubble. Now, most people might have panicked, not Dad. He had a solution. Butter. Yes, butter. Next thing you know, Kay's sitting on the floor at Mum's feet, and Bodo and I are practically stacked on top of each other behind her, just to keep the weight off that dodgy tyre. So every few Ks, when the noise got louder, we'd pull over, and out came the butter from the esky. Dad would smear it all over the tyre to reduce the friction. And believe it or not, it actually worked. The bubble held, and we made it through the entire trip without a breakdown, just with a lot of butter. Everybody thought he was mad, and me too. I was the cool teenager back then who just wanted to disappear in a puff of embarrassment. I mean, my friend's dad was driving a green Porsche. I now look back and think, yep, classic Dad. A bit crazy, a lot clever, and always determined to get us across the finish line, no matter what. So, jetzt geht's to here. That was one of Dad's favourite Bavarian sayings, meaning something like, and here we go. A few days before Dad died, I felt he was 100% present, completely there with me. He looked straight at me and said, so what was all that about? When I asked him what he meant, he said, my life. Dad, you always had a way of asking the big questions with a twinkle in your eye, like you already knew the answer. You just wanted to see if we were paying attention. Well, Dad, your life was anything but ordinary. It was colourful, messy, brilliant, unpredictable, a full spectrum of experience. You gave everything a crack. You laughed loud, loved deeply, challenged everything and everyone. You showed us that life isn't about playing it safe. It's about fully showing up, even if you sometimes skid in sideways, slightly battered. Dad, you lived fully and fiercely, and I believe you've headed off on your next great adventure. Wherever that may be, know that we carry your spirit with us. Your laugh, your lessons, and your wild ideas, your unstoppable heart. I know, deep in my heart, that we'll meet you again one day. And with that, we've chosen Dad's favourite waltz that he liked to listen to at New Year's, signalling a new beginning. So, Dad, jetzt geht's dahin.